Okay, so today we're going to be talking about The Art of Thinking Clearly, which is a book written by Rolf Dobelli. Now, before we begin, welcome. This is a place where we encourage you to think as opposed to telling you what to think. Now, I remember picking up this book. I was about to go on this 3-hour train journey, so I wanted to buy a book to read. And there were many books on the stand, but this particular book really caught my attention. This is where I learnt about cognitive biases, and for a long time this was my favorite book. This was like my Shakespeare, my Oscar Wilde, etc. So with that being said, we're going to discuss some concepts from this book, and the first concept we're going to discuss is survivorship bias. So the first obvious question is, what is survivorship bias? So in a simple sense, survivorship bias is when it's almost like you have a subgroup that is very visible, and this visible subgroup is mistaken for the whole group. I think the best way to explain this is to give some examples. So let's say you're going through social media and you're seeing a lot of, successful hip-hop artists. So let's say that's a subgroup, the successful hip-hop artists. Now you're going through social media and you're seeing a lot of this subgroup. You're seeing a lot of successful hip-hop artists. You're seeing the chains, you're seeing the watches, you're seeing the mansions, the cars, etc. Now, if you look at this, you might be mistaken in thinking that the subgroup, the successful hip-hop artist, is the majority representation of most people that try to chase the dream of becoming a successful hip-hop artist. I mean, you might say, well, that's ridiculous because it's easy to become a successful hip-hop artist. And my response would be, really? Another example could be get rich schemes. So you might again look on social media and you might see a lot of people that have quote unquote a successful life. So you might see them with the cars, the watches, the large amounts of money, etc. And this gives the appearance that this is the norm, or that this is easy to achieve. Now let's give another example. So we could do a Google search and we can have the impression that there are loads of successful book authors. So I would say that book authors, more successful book authors, are a small subset of the general population. But if we were to go through social media, we might have the impression through survivorship bias that this is the norm, that this is easy to achieve. And here's the problem with survivorship bias. It can corrupt our logical thinking. Survivorship biases can be problematic because they can give us a false sense of security. It can give us a false sense of confidence. It might make us think that being a successful musician is easy, when in reality it's still highly unlikely to be a successful musician. And that's not to say that one can't achieve the unlikely. I mean, you can look at the lottery. It's unlikely that you will win the lottery, but people do win the lottery. But the problem is when we use the survivorship bias to cloud our thinking into thinking the unlikely is likely. So to me, the lesson here is to be aware of the prison that can be presented when we get captivated by the survivorship bias. The next great lesson is the swimmer's body illusion. And you might be thinking, what is the swimmer's body illusion? And that's a good question, so let's answer it. The swimmer's body illusion is when we confuse traits with results. Let me repeat that because it's an important distinction. The swimmer's body illusion is where we confuse traits with results. So let's take John. John wants to have a swimmer's body, and he concludes that if he trains like a swimmer, then he will look like a swimmer. And on the surface, that might seem quite rational. So John, in an effort to achieve his goal of the swimmer's body, gets a swimming membership and he starts swimming 5 times a week. But despite John's efforts and despite his consistency, he's not reaching his goal of having the swimmer's body. And the question is, why is John not achieving his goal? So according to this logic, swimmers swim well because of their physiques, therefore their training is not necessarily a product of their physiques. So for example, to be a great swimmer, the logic here would be that genetically you would have a certain build, and therefore to be a great swimmer you start with this great build, as opposed to swimming for a long time and then you develop this great build. I feel like I may be overcomplicating this, so let me simplify it. The swimmer's body is a product of that person's genetics. To understand this, let's think of another example. You don't become a great chess player by playing lots of chess. To be a great chess player, you need to have a pre-wired mathematical capability or a pre-wired mathematical intelligence. Let's take another example. To be a great boxer, you need to have a great set of genetics. Now, of course, we can argue that there are other elements to the successful equation in terms of hard work, environment, consistency, etc. But this is digressing from the point. And the point to me here is that in becoming a great swimmer, you need the genetic materials of becoming a great swimmer. You need to start with that strong genetic foundation. And that's why John, even after he trained extensively, could not create the swimmer's body that he desired. Now you may say that you don't need any type of genetics. Through positive thinking you can achieve the great swimmer's body. And my response to that would be, really? The next lesson is more like a statement, and that statement is, cheerfulness is a personality trait. I mean, the context here is quite simple, so some people might say that happiness is a choice. Now think of this, happiness might be a choice for them, but it might not necessarily be a choice for you. This leads to the obvious question, how can happiness be a choice for me, but happiness isn't a choice for you? And the answer is quite simple. We are all different, we are all individuals, and therefore we all have different personality traits. This is interesting because based on this concept, you don't wake up and make a decision on whether to be happy or not happy. Based on this concept, you wake up and you are simply who you are, meaning that you're a product of your genetic makeup as opposed to being a product of your conscious decision making. I think it's important to acknowledge here for clarity that I've inserted the words genetic makeup. So, this is my interpretation of that statement. But what do you think? Do you think happiness is a personality trait? Do we wake up and do we make the decision of whether we're happy or not? Or are we just a product of our genetics? What's your thoughts? And if we do believe that happiness is a personality trait, can we change this? Can we change our programming? Can we change our personality traits? Now I chose this because I thought it's an interesting statement, it's an interesting observation, and it's an interesting philosophy. Now my next lesson is one of my favorite, and this is confirmation bias. Now before we move forward, let's first define what confirmation bias is. Quote, confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret or favor and recall information in a way that confirms or support one's prior beliefs or values. End of quote. As always, I feel some specific examples may help us understand what confirmation bias is. So let's take Leon. And Leon has a belief system. He believes that you can only get a six-pack through weight training. And in justifying this belief system, he cherry picks which studies correspond with his confirmation bias, and he disregards any information that might contradict his narrative that weight training is the only way to achieve a six-pack. I would say that this is a good example of confirmation bias. Let's take another one. So let's take Sally. And Sally has the belief system that all great musicians, all great artists are substance affected. And in justifying this, she'll name 7 artists, 7 great artists that are substance affected. The problem with this though is that she disregards all the other great artists which are not substance affected. This again is another example of confirmation bias. Let's give 2 more examples. So let's take David. And David says that the only way to make money is through real estate investing. So you can only make money through properties, according to David. So that's his confirmation bias. But Laura believes that the only way you can make money is through digital currencies. So that's her confirmation bias. Now, when a confirmation bias is wrong, it can be particularly damaging. I mean, it can damage relationships, it can damage businesses, it can damage communities, etc. But with that being said, we all have confirmation biases, and it's important that we acknowledge these confirmation biases. So that was a brief look at the book, The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli. To me, this is a masterpiece in intelligent thinking. This book is definitely one for the bookshelf, and it's definitely an asset to the genre of smart thinking. Now, if you enjoyed the video and you want support, then like and subscribe. I repeat, if you enjoyed the video and you want to support, then like and subscribe. And if you're feeling even more generous, then why not share the video on your social media platforms? Now, with that being said, I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content.